Section 1 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Scott. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 1. A Bully Boat and a Brag Captain by Saul Smith. A story of steamboat life on the Mississippi. Does anyone remember the Caravan? She was what would now be considered a slow boat. Then, 1827, she was regularly advertised as the fast-running, etc. Her regular trips from New Orleans to Natchez were usually made in from 6 to 8 days. A trip made by her in 5 days was considered remarkable. A voyage from New Orleans to Vicksburg and back, including stoppages, generally entitled the officers and crew to a month's wages. Whether the Caravan ever achieved the feat of a voyage to the Falls, Louisville, I have never learned. If she did, she must have had a time of it. It was my fate to take passage on this boat. The captain was a good-natured, easy-going man, careful of the comfort of his passengers, and exceedingly fond of the game of brag. We had been out a little more than 5 days, and we were in hopes of seeing the bluffs of Natchez on the next day. Our wood was getting low and night coming on. The pilot on duty above, the other pilot held 3 aces at the time and was just calling out the captain, who went it strong on 3 kings, sent down word that the mate had reported the stock of wood reduced to half a cord. The worthy captain excused himself to the pilot, whose watch was below, and the 2 passengers who made up the party, and hurried to the deck, where he soon discovered by the landmarks that we were about half a mile from a wood yard, which he said was situated right round yonder point. "But," muttered the captain, "I don't much like to take wood of the yellow-faced old scoundrel who owns it. He always charges $0.25 more than anyone else. However, there's no other chance." The boat was pushed to her utmost, and in a little less than an hour, when our fuel was about giving out, we made the point, and our cables were out and fastened to trees alongside of a good-sized woodpile. "Hello, Colonel! How do you sell your wood this time?" A yellow-faced old gentleman, with a 2 weeks' beard, strings over his shoulders, holding up to his armpits a pair of copperas-colored linsey-woolsey pants, the legs of which reached a very little below the knee, shoes without stockings, a faded, broad-brimmed hat, which had once been black, and a pipe in his mouth, casting a glance at the empty guards of our boat, and uttering a grunt as he rose from fastening our spring line, answered, "Why, capting, we must charge you 3 1/4 this time." "The devil!" replied the captain. Captains did swear a little in those days. "What's the odd quarter for, I should like to know? You only charged me 3 as I went down." "Why, capting," drawled out the wood merchant, with a sort of leer on his yellow countenance, which clearly indicated that his wood was as good as sold, "wood's riz since you went down 2 weeks ago. Besides, you are aware that you very seldom stop going down. When you're going up, you're sometimes obleeged to give me a call, because the current's against you, and there's no other wood yard for 9 miles ahead. And if you happen to be nearly out of fuel, why—" "Well, well," interrupted the captain, "we'll take a few cords under the circumstances." And he returned to his game of brag. In about half an hour we felt the Caravan commence paddling again. Supper was over, and I retired to my upper berth, situated alongside and overlooking the brag table, where the captain was deeply engaged, having now the other pilot as his principal opponent. We jogged on quietly, and seemed to be going at a good rate. "How does that wood burn?" inquired the captain of the mate, who was looking on at the game. "'Tisn't of much account, I reckon," answered the mate. It's cottonwood, and most of it green at that." "Well, Thompson, 3 aces again, stranger. I'll take that X and the small change, if you please. It's your deal. Thompson, I say, we'd better take 3 or 4 cords at the next woodyard. It can't be more than 6 miles from here. 2 aces and a bragger with the age. Hand over those V's." The game went on, and the paddles kept moving. At 11 o'clock it was reported to the captain that we were nearing the woodyard, the light being distinctly seen by the pilot on duty. "Head her in shore, then, and take in 6 cords if it's good. See to it, Thompson. I can't very well leave the game now. It's getting right warm. This pilot's beating us all to smash." The wooding completed, we paddled on again. The captain seemed somewhat vexed when the mate informed him that the price was the same as at the last woodyard, 3 1/4, but soon again became interested in the game. From my upper berth, there were no staterooms then, I could observe the movements of the players. All the contention appeared to be between the captain and the pilots. The latter personages took it turn and turn about, steering and playing brag, one of them almost invariably winning, while the 2 passengers merely went through the ceremony of dealing, cutting, and paying up their antes. They were anxious to learn the game, and they did learn it. Once in a while, indeed, seeing they had 2 aces and a bragger, they would venture a bet of $5 or $10, but they were always compelled to back out before the tremendous bragging of the captain or pilot, or if they did venture to call out on 2 bullets and a bragger, they had the mortification to find one of the officers had the same kind of hand and were more venerable. Still, with all these disadvantages, they continued playing. They wanted to learn the game. At 2 o'clock the captain asked the mate how we were getting on. "Oh, pretty glibly, sir," replied the mate. "We can scarcely tell what headway we are making, for we are obliged to keep the middle of the river, and there is the shadow of a fog rising. This wood seems rather better than what we took in at Yellow Faces, but we're nearly out again, and must be looking out for more. I saw a light just ahead on the right. Shall we hail?" "Yes, yes," replied the captain. "Ring the bell and ask 'em what's the price of wood up here." "I've got you again. Here's double kings." I heard the bell and the pilot hail, "What's your price for wood?" A youthful voice on the shore answered, 3 1/4. "Damn it!" ejaculated the captain, who had just lost the price of 2 cords to the pilot, the stranger suffering some at the same time. 3 1/4 again! Are we never to get to a cheaper country? Deal, sir, if you please. Better luck next time." The other pilot's voice was again heard on deck. "How much have you?" "Only about 10 cords, sir," was the reply of the youthful salesman. The captain here told Thompson to take 6 cords, which would last till daylight, and again turned his attention to the game. The pilots here changed places. When did they sleep? Wood taken in, the caravan again took her place in the middle of the stream, paddling on as usual. Day at length dawned. The brag party broke up, and settlements were being made, during which operations the captain's bragging propensities were exercised in cracking up the speed of his boat, which, by his reckoning, must have made at least 60 miles, and would have made many more if he could have procured good wood. It appears the 2 passengers, in their first lesson, had incidentally lost $120. The captain, as he rose to see about taking in some good wood, which he felt sure of obtaining now that he had got above the level country, winked at his opponent the pilot, with whom he had been on very bad terms during the progress of the game, and said in an undertone, "40 apiece for you and I and James," the other pilot, "is not bad for one night." I had risen and went out with the captain to enjoy a view of the bluffs. There was just fog enough to prevent the vision taking in more than 60 yards, so I was disappointed in my expectation. We were nearing the shore for the purpose of looking for wood, the banks being invisible from the middle of the river. There it is!" exclaimed the captain. "Stop her!" Ding, ding, ding went the big bell, and the captain hailed, "Hullo, the woodyard!" "Hullo yourself!" answered a squeaking female voice, which came from a woman with a petticoat over her shoulders in place of a shawl. "What's the price of wood?" "I think you ought to know the price by this time," answered the old lady in the petticoat. "It's 3¼ now you know it." "Three and the devil!" broke in the captain. "What, have you raised on your wood too? I'll give you 3 and not a cent more." "Well," replied the petticoat, "here comes the old man. He'll talk to you." And sure enough, out crept from the cottage the veritable faded hat, copperas-colored pants, yellow countenance, and 2 weeks' beard we had seen the night before, and the same voice we had heard regulating the price of cottonwood squeaked out the following sentence, accompanied by the same leer of the same yellow countenance. "Why, darn it all, capting, there is but 3 or 4 cords left, and since it's you, I don't care if I do let you have it for 3, as you're a good customer." After a quick glance at the landmarks around, the captain bolted and turned in to take some rest. The fact became apparent, the reader will probably have discovered it some time since, that we had been wooding all night at the same woodyard. End of section 1. Recording by Bob Scott.
Section 2 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2, edited by Thomas Lansing Mason. Section 2. The Dog and the Bees, by Ambrose Bierce. A dog, being very much annoyed by bees, ran quite accidentally into an empty barrel lying on the ground, and looking out at the bunghole, addressed his tormentors thus: "Had you been temperate, stinging me only one at a time, you might have got a good deal of fun out of me. As it is, you have driven me into a secure retreat, for I can snap you up as fast as you come in through the bunghole. Learn from this the folly of intemperate zeal." When he had concluded, he awaited a reply. There wasn't any reply, for the bees had never gone near the bunghole. They went in the same way as he did, and made it very warm for him. The lesson of this fable is that one cannot stick to his pure reason while quarreling with bees. End of Section 2. Recording by Donald Ruiz, Jr.
Section 3 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2, edited by Thomas Lansing Mason. Section 3. Dislikes, by Oliver Wendell Holmes. I want it to be understood that I consider that a certain number of persons are at liberty to dislike me peremptorily, without showing cause, and that they give no offence whatever in so doing. If I did not cheerfully acquiesce in this sentiment toward myself on the part of others, I should not feel at liberty to indulge my own aversions. I try to cultivate a Christian feeling to all my fellow creatures, but inasmuch as I must also respect truth and honesty, I confess to myself a certain number of inalienable dislikes and prejudices, some of which may possibly be shared by others. Some of these are purely instinctive. For others I can assign a reason. Our likes and dislikes play so important a part in the order of things, that it is as well to see on what they are founded. There are persons I meet occasionally who are too intelligent by half for my liking. They know my thoughts beforehand, and tell me what I was going to say. Of course they are masters of all my knowledge, and a good deal besides; have read all the books I have read, and in later editions; have had all the experiences I have been through, and more too. In my private opinion, every mother's son of them will lie at any time rather than confess ignorance. I have a kind of dread, rather than hatred, of persons with a large excess of vitality, great feeders, great laughers, great story–tellers, who come sweeping over their company with a huge tidal wave of animal spirits and boisterous merriment. I have pretty good spirits myself, and enjoy a little mild pleasantry, but I am oppressed and extinguished by these great lusty noisy creatures, and feel as if I were a mute at a funeral when they get into full blast. I cannot get along much better with those drooping languid people whose vitality falls short as much as that of the others is in excess. I have not life enough for two. I wish I had. It is not very enlivening to meet a fellow–creature whose expression and accent say, "You are the hair that breaks the camel's back of my endurance. You are the last drop that makes my cup of woe run over." Persons whose heads drop on one side like those of toothless infants, whose voices recall the tones in which our old snuffling choir used to wail out the verse of "Life is the time to serve the Lord." There is another style which does not captivate me. I recognize an attempt at the grand manner, now and then, in persons who are well enough in their way, but of no particular importance, socially or otherwise. Some family tradition of wealth or distinction is apt to be at the bottom of it, and it survives all the advantages that used to set it off. I like family pride as well as my neighbours, and respect the high–born fellow–citizen whose progenitors have not worked in their shirt–sleeves for the last 2 generations full as much as I ought to. But grand–père oblige, a person with a known grandfather is too distinguished to find it necessary to put on airs. A few royal princes I have happened to know were very easy people to get along with, and had not half the social neat action I have often seen in the collapsed dowagers, who lifted their eyebrows at me in my earlier years. My heart does not warm as it should do toward the persons, not intimates, who are always too glad to see me when we meet by accident, and discover all at once that they have a vast deal to unbosom themselves to me. There is one blameless person whom I cannot love and have no excuse for hating. It is the innocent fellow–creature, otherwise inoffensive to me, whom I find I have involuntarily joined on turning a corner. I suppose the Mississippi, which was flowing quietly along, minding its own business, hates the Missouri for coming into it all at once with its muddy stream. I suppose the Missouri in like manner hates the Mississippi for diluting with its limpid but insipid current the rich reminiscences of the varied soils through which its own stream has wandered. I will not compare myself to the clear or the turbid current, but I will own that my heart sinks when I find all of a sudden I am in for a corner confluence, and I cease loving my neighbour as myself until I can get away from him. The Poet at the Breakfast–table. An Illinois boy was asked to write an essay on Masonry, and here is what he wrote. King Solomon was a man who lived so many years in the country that he was the whole push. He was an awfully wise man, and one day 2 women came to him, each holding to the leg of a baby, and nearly pulling it in 2, and each claiming it. And King Solomon wasn't feeling right good, and he said, "Why couldn't the brat have been twins and stopped this bother?" And then he called for his machete, and was going to Weilerize the poor innocent little baby, and give each woman a piece of it, when the real mother of the baby said, "Stop, Solomon, stay thy hand. Let the old hag have it. If I can't have the whole baby, I won't have any." Then Solomon told her to take the baby and go home and wash its face, for he knew it was hers. He told the other woman to go chase herself. King Solomon built Solomon's temple, and was the father of masons. He had 700 wives and 300 lady friends, and that's why there are so many masons in the world. My papa says King Solomon was a warm member, and I think he was hot stuff myself. That is all I know about King Solomon. End of section 3.
Section 4 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Curran. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2, edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 4. Illustrated Newspapers by G.H. Derby. A year or two since, a weekly paper was started in London called The Illustrated News. It was filled with tolerably executed woodcuts representing scenes of popular interest, and, though perhaps better calculated for the nursery than the reading room, it took very well in England, where few can read but all can understand pictures, and soon attained immense circulation. As when the inimitable London Punch attained its worldwide celebrity, supported by such writers as Thackeray, Gerard, and Hood, would-be funny men on this side of the Atlantic attempted absurd imitations, the Yankee Doodle, the John Donkey, etc., which, as a matter of course, proved miserable failures. So did the success of this illustrated affair inspire our money-loving publishers with hopes of dollars, and soon appeared from Boston, New York, and other places pictorial and illustrated newspapers, teeming with execrable and silly effusions, and filled with the most fearful wood engravings, got up regardless of expense or anything else, the contemplation of which was enough to make an artist tear his hair and render his garments. A Yankee named Gleason, of Boston, published the first, we believe, calling it Gleason's Pictorial. It should have been Gleason's Pickpocket and Drawing Room Companion. In this he presented to his unhappy subscribers views of his house in the country, and his garden, and, for aught we know, of his ox and his ass, and the strangers within his gates. A detestable invention for transferring daguerreotypes to plates for engraving, having come into notice about this time, was eagerly seized upon by Gleason for further embellishing his catchpenny publication. Duplicates and uncalled-for pictures were easily obtained, and many a man has gazed in horror-stricken astonishment on the likeness of a respected friend as a portrait of Monroe Edwards, or that of his deceased grandmother, in the character of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. They love pictures in Yankeedom. Every tin peddler has one on his wagon, and an itinerant lecturer can always obtain an audience by sticking up a likeness of some unhappy female, with her ribs laid open in an impossible manner for public inspection, or a hairless gentleman with the surface of his head laid out in legible lots duly marked and numbered. The factory girls of Lowell, the professors of Harvard, all bought the new pictorial. Professor Weber was reading one when Dr. Parkman called on him on the morning of the murder. Gleason's speculation was crowned with success, and he bought himself a new cooking stove and erected an outbuilding on his estate, with both of which he favored the public in a new woodcut immediately. Inspired by success, old Freejack Merman Tom Thumb Woolery Horse Joyce Heath Barnum forthwith got out another illustrated weekly with pictures far more extensive, letterpress still sillier, and engravings more miserable, if possible, than the Yankee Gleasons. And then we were bored and buffeted by having incredible likenesses of Santa Anna, Queen Victoria, and the poor old Webster thrust beneath our nose, to that degree that we wish the respected originals had never existed, or that the art of wood engraving had perished with that of painting on glass. It was, therefore, with some intense delight that we saw a notice the other day of the failure and stoppage of Barnum's Illustrated News. We rejoiced thereout greatly, and we hope that it will never be revived, and that Gleason will also fail as soon as he conveniently can, and that his trashy pictorial will perish with it. It must not be supposed from the tenor of these remarks that we are opposed to the publication of the properly conducted and creditably executed illustrated paper. On the contrary, quite reverse. We are passionately fond of the art ourselves, and we believe that nothing can have a stronger tendency to refinement in society than presenting to the public chaste and elaborate engravings, copies of works of high artistic merit, accompanied by graphic and well-written essays. It was for the purpose of introducing a paper containing these features to our appreciative community that we have made these introductory remarks, and for the purpose of challenging comparison and defying competition that we have criticized so severely the incipial and ephemeral productions mentioned above. At a vast expenditure of money, time, and labor, and after the most incredible and unheard of exertion on our part individually, we are at length able to present to the public an illustrated publication of unprecedented merit, containing engravings of exceeding costliness and rare beauty of design, got up on an expensive scale, which never have been attempted before in this or any other country. We furnish our readers this week with the first number, merely premising that the immense expense attending its issue will require a corresponding liberality of patronage on the part of the public to cause it to be continued. Portrait of His Royal Highness Prince Albert. Prince Albert, son of a gentleman named Coburg, is the husband of Queen Victoria of England and the father of many of her children. He is the inventor of the celebrated Albert hat, which has been lately introduced with great effect in the U.S. Army. The prince is of German extraction, his father being a Dutchman and his mother being a duchess. The Battle of Lake Erie, of which our artist presents a spirited engraving, copied from the original painting by Hannibal Carracci, in the possession of J.P. Haven, Esquire, was fought in 1836 on Chesapeake Bay between the U.S. frigates Constitution and Guerriere and the British troops under General Putnam. Our glorious flag, there as everywhere, was victorious, and long may it wave over the land of the free and the home of the slave. There, this is but a specimen of what we can do if liberally sustained. We wait with anxiety to hear the verdict of the public before proceeding to do any further and greater outlays. Subscription, $5 per annum, payable invariably in advance. Inducements for clubbing, 20 copies furnished for 1 year for 50 cents. Address, John Phoenix, Office of the San Diego Herald. End of Section 4.
Section 5 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Claudia Barrett. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Mason. Section 5. Susan Simpson, Author Unknown. Sudden swallows swiftly skimming, sunset slowly spreading shade, silvery songsters sweetly singing, summer's soothing serenade. Susan Simpson strolls sedately, stifling sobs, suppressing sighs. Seeing Stephen Slocum stately, she stopped, showing some surprise. "Say," said Stephen, "sweetest sire, say, shall Stephen spouseless stay?" Susan, seeming somewhat shyer, shows submissiveness straightway. Summer season slowly stretches, Susan Simpson Slocum she. So she signs some simple sketches, soul sought, sold successfully. 6 September Susan swelters, 6 sharp seasons snow supplies. Susan satin sofa shelters, 6 small Slocums side by side. End of Section 5. Recording by Claudia Barrett.
Section 6 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2, edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 6. Mary Mapes Dodge, Miss Maloney on the Chinese Question.
Och, don't be talking. It is howled on, ye say? And didn't I howled on to the heart of me was clean broke entirely, and me wasting that thin you could clutch me with your 2 hands. To think o' me toiling like a nigger for the 6 year I've been in Ameriky. Bad luck to the day I ever left the old country. To be bait by the likes of them. Faix, and I'll sit down when I'm ready, so I will, Ann Ryan, and ye'd better be listening than drawing your remarks. And it's mysel, with 5 good characters from respectable places, would be herding with the heathens. The saints forgive me, but I'd be buried alive soon and put up with a day longer. Sure, and I was a greenhorn not to be laving at once when the missus kim into me kitchen with her palaver about the new waiter man which was brought out from California. He'll be here the night, says she, and Kitty, it's meself looks to you to be kind and patient with him, for he's a furriner, says she, a kind of looking off. Sure, and it's a little I'll hinder nor interfere with him nor any other, mum, says I, a kind of stiff, for I minded me how these French waiters, with their paper collars and brass rings on their fingers, isn't company for no girl brought up decent and honest. Och, so a bit I knew what was coming, till the missus walked into me kitchen smiling and says, kind of scared, "Here's Fing Wing, Kitty, and you'll have too much sense to mind his being a little strange." With that she shuts the door, and I, mistrusting if I was tidied up sufficient for me fine by with his paper collar, looks up and, holy fathers, may I never breathe another breath, but there stood a rail heathen Chineser, a grinning like he'd just come off of a tea box. And you'll believe me, the creature was that yeller, it 'ud sicken you to see him. And so a stitch was on him but a black nightgown over his trousers, and the front of his head shaved cleaner nor a copper biler, and a black tail a-hanging down from behind, with his 2 feet stuck into the heathenest shoes you ever set eyes on. Och, but I was upstairs before you could turn about. I'd given the missus warning, and only stopped with her by her raising me wages $2 and playing with me how it was a Christian's duty to bear with heathens and teach 'em all in our power. The saints save us. Well, the ways and trials I had with that Chineser Ann Ryan I couldn't be telling. Not a blessed thing could I do, but he'd be looking on with his eyes cocked up hard like 2 pump handles, and he without a speck or a smidge of whiskers on him, and his fingernails full a yard long. But it's dying you'd be to see the missus a-larning him, and he grinning and wagging his pigtail, which was pieced out long with some black stuff, the heathen chate. It getting into her ways wonderful quick, I don't deny, imitating that sharp. You'd be surprised, and catching and copying things the best of us will do a-hurried with work you don't want coming into the knowledge of the family. Bad luck to him. Is it 8 with him? Arrah, and wouldn't I be sitting with a heathen, and he a-ating with drumsticks? Yes, and ating dogs and cats unknownst to me, I warrant you, which is the custom of them Chinesers. Till the thought made me that sick I could die. And didn't the creature proffer to help me a week ago come Tuesday, and me a-folding down me clean clothes for the ironing, and fill his heathen mouth with wather, and afore I could hinder, squirt it through his teeth straight over the best linen tablecloth, and fold it up tight, as innocent now as a baby, The dirty baste! But the worst of all was the copying he'd be doing, till you'd be distracted. It's yourself knows the tinder feet that's on me since ever I been in this country. Well, owing to that, I fell into the way o' slipping me shoes off when I'd be sitting down to pale the praties or likes o' that. And d'ye mind, that haythen would do the same thing after me whenever the missus set him paring apples or tomaterses. The saints in heaven couldn't have made him belave he could kape the shoes on him when he'd be paling anything. Did I lave for that? Fix! And didn't he get me into trouble with my missus, the haythen? You're aware yourself how the bundles coming from the grocery often contains more'n'll go into anything decently. So for that matter, I'd now and then take out a sup of sugar or flour or tea and wrap it in paper and put it in me bit of a box tucked under the ironing blanket, the how it couldn't be bothering anyone. Well, what should it be but this blessed Saturday morn, the missus was a spaking pleasant and respectful wid me in me kitchen, when the grocer boy comes in and stands for enster wid his bundles, and she motions like to Fing Wing, which I never would call him by that name, nor any other, but just haythen. She motions to him, she does, for to take the bundles and empty out the sugar and what not where they belongs. If you'll belave me, Ann Ryan, what did that blatherin' Chineser do but take out a sup of sugar and a handful of tea and a bit of chaze right afore the missus, wrap them into bits o' paper, and I speechless wid surprise, and he the next minute up wid the ironing blanket and pulling out me box wid a show of being sly to put them in. Och, the Lord forgive me, but I clutched it, and the missus saying, "Oh, Kitty," in a way that'd curdle your blood. "He's a haythen nagger," says I. "I've found you out," says she. "I'll arrest him," says I. "It's you ought to be arrested," says she. "You won't," says I. "I will," says she. And so it went, till she gave me such sass as I couldn't take it from no lady, and I give her warning and left that instant, and she a pointing to the door.
End of section 6.
Section 7 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humour, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humour, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 7. The Cross-Eyed Woman, by Bill Nye. It is now the proper time for the cross-eyed woman to fool with the garden hose. I have faced death in almost every form, and I do not know what fear is, but when a woman with one eye gazing into the zodiac, and the other peering into the middle of next week, and wearing one of those floppy sunbonnets, picks up the nozzle of the garden hose and turns on the full force of the institution, I fly wildly to the mountains of Hepsidam. Water won't hurt anyone, of course, if care is used not to forget and drink any of it. But it is this horrible suspense and uncertainty about facing the nozzle of a garden hose in the hands of a cross-eyed woman that unnerves and paralyzes me. Instantaneous death is nothing to me. I am as cool and collected where leaden rain and iron hail are thickest as I would be in my own office writing the obituary of a man who steals my jokes. But I hate to be drowned slowly in my good clothes and on dry land, and have my dying gaze rest on a woman whose ravishing beauty would drive a narrow-gauge mule into convulsions and make him hate himself to death. End of section 7.
Section 8 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording.
All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2, edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 8. James Russell Lowell. The Courtin'. God makes sech nights, all white and still, fur's you can look or listen. Moonshine and snow on field and hill, all silence and all glisten. Zekel crep up quite unbeknown, and peeked in through the winder, and there sot Huldy all alone, ith no one nigh to hender. A fireplace filled the room's one side, with half a cord o' wood in. There warn't no stoves, tell comfort died, to bake ye to a puddin'. The wa'nut logs shot sparkles out toward the pootiest, bless her, and leetle flames danced about the chiny on the dresser. Agin the chimbly crook necks hung, and in amongst 'em rusted the old Queen's arm that Granther Young fetched back from Concord, busted. The very room, 'cause she was in, seemed warm from floor to ceilin', and she looked full as rosy agin as the apples she was peelin'. 'Twas kind o' kingdom come to look on sech a blessed creature. A dog rose blushin' to a brook ain't modester nor sweeter. He was 6 foot o' man, A1, clear grit and human nature. None couldn't quicker pitch a ton, nor dror a furrer straighter. He'd sparked it with full 20 gals. He'd squired 'em, danced 'em, druv 'em, fussed this one and then thet by spells. All is, he couldn't love 'em. But long o'er his veins 'ould run, all crinkly like curled maple, the side she breshed felt full o' sun as a south slope in April. She thought no vice hed sech a swing as his'n in the choir. My, when he made Ol' 100 ring, she knowed the Lord was nigher. And she'd blush scarlet right in prayer when her new meetin' bunnet felt somehow through its crown a pair o' blue eyes sot upon it. Thet night, I tell ye, she looked some. She seemed to've got a new soul, for she felt sartin sure he'd come, down to her very shoe sole. She heerd a foot, and knowed it, too, a raspin' on the scraper. Always to once her feelin's flew like sparks in burnt up paper. He kin 'a' littered on the mat, some doubtful o' the seckle. His heart kept goin' pitty-pat, but hern went pitty-zeckle. And yit she gin her chair a jerk, as though she wished him furder, and on her apples kept to work, parin' away like murder. You want to see my pa, I s'pose? Well, no, I come designin' to see my ma. She's sprinklin' clothes agin tomorrow's ironin'. To say why gals act so, or don't, would be presumin'. Mebbe to mean yes and say no comes natural to women. He stood a spell on one foot fust, then stood a spell on t'other, and on which one he felt the wust he couldn't ha' told ye nother. Says he, "I'd better call agin." Says she, "Think likely, mister." That last word pricked him like a pin, and, well, he up and kissed her. When Ma Bimeby upon 'em slips,
Huldy sot pale as ashes, all kin o' smiley round the lips, and teary round the lashes, for she was just the quiet kind whose natures never vary, like streams that keep a summer mind snow-hid in January. The blood clost round her heart felt glued too tight for all expressin', till mother see how metters stood, and gin 'em both her blessin'. Then her red come back like the tide down to the Bay of Fundy, and all I know is they was cried in meetin' come next Sunday. End of section 8.
Section 9 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melvin Lee. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2, edited by Thomas Lansing Mason. Section 9, The Coquette, a Portrait, by John Godfrey Saxe. "You're clever at drawing, I own," said my beautiful cousin Lizette, as we sat by the window alone. "But say, can you paint a coquette?" "She's painted already," quoth I. "Nay, nay," said the laughing Lizette, "now none of your joking, but try and paint me a thorough coquette." "Well, cousin," at once I began, in the ear of the eager Lizette, "I'll paint you as well as I can that wonderful thing, a coquette. She wears a most beautiful face." "Of course," said the pretty Lizette, "and isn't deficient in grace, or else she were not a coquette. And then she is daintily made," a smile from the dainty Lizette, "by people expert in the trade of forming a proper coquette. She's the winningest ways with the bow." "Go on," said the winning Lizette, "but there isn't a man of them knows the mind of the fickle coquette. She knows how to weep and to sigh," a sigh from the tender Lizette, "but her weeping is all in my eye, not that of the cunning coquette. In short, she's a creature of art." "Oh, hush," said the frowning Lizette, "but merely with the ghost of a heart, enough for a thorough coquette." "And yet I could easily prove—" "No, don't," said the angry Lizette, "the lady is always in love with herself, the coquette." "There, now do not be angry, you know, my dear little cousin Lizette. You told me a moment ago to paint you a thorough coquette." Henry Ward Beecher, in his famous speech at Manchester, England, in which he talked for an hour against a howling mob of rebel sympathizers before he gained their attention, was interrupted by a man in the audience who shouted, "Why didn't you whip the Confederates in 60 days as you said you would?" "Because," replied Beecher, "we found we had Americans to fight instead of Englishmen." End of section 9.
Section 10 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Megan Larson. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2, edited by Thomas Lansing Mason. Section 10, Colonel Mulberry Sellers, by Samuel L. Clemens, Mark Twain. Colonel Mulberry Sellers was in his library, which was his drawing-room, which was also his picture-gallery, and likewise his workshop. Sometimes he called it by one of these names, sometimes by another, according to the occasion and circumstance. He was constructing what seemed to be some kind of frail mechanical toy, and was apparently very much interested in his work. He was a white-headed man now, but otherwise he was as young, alert, buoyant, visionary, and enterprising as ever. His loving old wife sat near by, contentedly knitting and thinking, with a cat asleep in her lap. The room was large, light, and had a comfortable look, in fact a home-like look, though the furniture was of a humble sort, and not over-abundant, and the knick-knacks and things that go to adorn a living-room not plenty and not costly. But there were natural flowers, and there was an abstract and unclassifiable something about the place which betrayed the presence in the house of somebody with a happy taste and an effective touch. Even the deadly chromos on the walls were somehow without offense. In fact, they seemed to belong there, and to add an attraction to the room, a fascination anyway, for whoever got his eye on one of them was like to gaze and suffer till he died. You have seen that kind of pictures. Some of these terrors were landscapes, some libeled the sea, some were ostensible portraits, all were crimes. All the portraits were recognizable as dead Americans of distinction, and yet through labeling added by a daring hand, they were all doing duty here as Earls of Rossmore. The newest one had left the works as Andrew Jackson, but was doing its best now as Simon Lathers, Lord Rossmore, present Earl. On one wall was a cheap old railroad map of Warwickshire. This had been newly labelled the Rossmore Estates. On the opposite wall was another map, and this was the most imposing decoration of the establishment, and the first to catch a stranger's attention because of its great size. It had once borne simply the title Siberia, but now the word Future had been written in front of that word. There were other additions in red ink, many cities with great populations set down, scattered over the vast country at points where neither cities nor populations exist today. One of these cities, with population placed at 1,500,000, bore the name Liberty-Orlovskoye-Zelinsky, and there was a still more populous one, centrally located and marked Capital, which bore the name Freedomslav-Naivnovich. The mansion, the colonel's usual name for the house, was a rickety old 2-story frame of considerable size, which had been painted some time or other, but had nearly forgotten it. It was away out in the ragged edge of Washington, and had once been somebody's country place. It had a neglected yard around it, with a paling fence that needed straightening up in places, and a gate that would stay shut. By the doorpost were several modest tin signs. Colonel Mulberry Sellers, attorney at law and claim agent, was the principal one. One learned from the others that the colonel was a materializer, a hypnotizer, a mind-cure dabbler, and so on, for he was a man who could always find things to do. A white-headed Negro man with spectacles and damaged white cotton gloves appeared in the presence, made a stately obeisance, and announced, "Marse Washington Hawkins, sir." "Great Scott! Show 'em in, Dan'l, show 'em in." The colonel and his wife were on their feet in a moment, and the next moment were joyfully wringing the hands of a stoutish, discouraged-looking man, whose general aspect suggested that he was 50 years old, but whose hair swore to 100.
"Well, well, well, Washington, my boy, it is good to look at you again. Sit down, and make yourself at home. There now, why, you look perfectly natural, aging a little, just a little, but you'd have known him anywhere, wouldn't you, Polly?"
"Oh, yes, Barry, he's just like his pa would have looked if he'd lived. Dear, dear, where have you dropped from? Let me see, how long is it since—"
"I should say it's all of 15 years, Mrs. Sellers."
"Well, well, how time does get away with us. Yes, and oh, the changes that—"
There was a sudden catch of her voice and a trembling of the lip. The men waited reverently for her to get command of herself and go on, but after a little struggle she turned away with her apron to her eyes and softly disappeared.
"Seeing you made her think of the children, poor thing. Dear, dear, they're all dead but the youngest. But banish care, it's no time for it now. On with the dance, let joy be unconfided, is my motto. Whether there's any dance to dance, or any joy to unconfide, you'll be the healthier for it every time. Every time, Washington. It's my experience, and I've seen a good deal of this world. Come, where have you disappeared to all these years, and are you from there now, or where are you from?"
"I don't quite think you would ever guess, Colonel. Cherokee Strip."
"My land! Sure as you live. You can't mean it, actually living out there?"
"Well, yes, if a body may call it that. though it's a pretty strong term for dobies and jackass rabbits, boiled beans and slapjack, depression, withered hopes, poverty in all its varieties.
Louise out there?
Yes, and the children.
Out there now?
Yes, I couldn't afford to bring 'em with me.
Oh, I see. You had to come. Claim against the government. Make yourself perfectly easy. I'll take care of that.
But it isn't a claim against the government.
No? Want to be a postmaster? That's all right. Leave it to me. I'll fix it.
But it isn't postmaster. You're all astray yet.
Well, good gracious, Washington, why don't you come out and tell me what it is? What do you want to be so reserved and distrustful with an old friend like me for? Don't you reckon I can keep a
There's no secret about it. You merely don't give me the chance to—
Now look here, old friend, I know the human race, and I know that when a man comes to Washington, I don't care if it's from heaven, let alone Cherokee Strip, it's because he wants something. And I know that as a rule he's not going to get it. And that he'll stay and try for another thing and won't get that. The same luck with the next, and the next, and the next, and keeps on till he strikes bottom and is too poor and ashamed to go back even to Cherokee Strip. And at last his heart breaks, and they take up a collection and bury him. There, don't interrupt me. I know what I'm talking about. Happy and prosperous in the far west, wasn't I? You know that. Principal citizen of Hawkeye, looked up to by everybody. Kind of an autocrat. Actually kind of an autocrat, Washington. Well, nothing would I do but I must go as minister to St. James's. The governor and everybody insisting, you know, and so at last I consented. No getting out of it. Had to do it. So here I came. A day too late, Washington. Think of that. What little things changed the world's history? Yes, sir, the place had been filled. Well, there I was, you see. I offered to compromise and go to Paris. The president was very sorry and all that, but that place, you see, didn't belong to the West, so there I was again. There was no help for it. So I had to stoop a little. We all reach the day some time or other when we've got to do that, Washington, and it's not a bad thing for us either, take it by and large all around. I had to stoop a little, and offer to take Constantinople. Washington, consider this, for it's perfectly true. Within a month I asked for China. Within another month I begged for Japan. 1 year later I was away down, 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 supplicating with tears and anguish for the bottom office in the gift of the government of the United States, flint picker in the cellars of the War Department. And by George, I didn't get it.
Flint picker?
Yes. Office established in the time of the Revolution. Last century, the musket flints for the military posts were supplied from the capital. They do it yet. For although the flint arm has gone out, and the forts have tumbled down, the decree hasn't been repealed, been overlooked and forgotten, you see. And so the vacancies where old Ticonderoga and others used to stand still get their 6 quarts of gunflints a year just the same.
Washington said musingly after a pause. How strange it seems, to start for minister to England at 20,000 a year and fail for flint picker at
$3 a week. It's human life, Washington, just an epitome of human ambition and struggle. The outcome, you aim for the palace and get drowned in the sewer.
There was another meditative silence. Then Washington said, with earnest compassion in his voice, "And so, after coming here, against your inclination, to satisfy your sense of patriotic duty and appease a selfish public clamor, you get absolutely nothing for it?"
"Nothing?"
The colonel had to get up and stand to get room for his amazement to expand.
"Nothing, Washington. I ask you this. To be a perpetual member, and the only perpetual member of a diplomatic body accredited to the greatest country on earth, do you call that nothing?"
It was Washington's turn to be amazed. He was stricken dumb. But the wide-eyed wonder, the reverent admiration expressed in his face, were more eloquent than any words could have been. The colonel's wounded spirit was healed, and he resumed his seat, pleased and content. He leaned forward and said impressively,
"What was due to a man who had become forever conspicuous by an experience without precedence in the history of the world, a man made permanently and diplomatically sacred, so to speak, by having been connected, temporarily, through solicitation, with every single diplomatic post in the roster of this government, from envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to the court of St. James's, all the way down to consul to a guano rock in the Straits of Sunda, salary payable in guano, which disappeared by volcanic convulsion the day before they got down to my name in the list of applicants. Certainly something august enough to be answerable to the size of this unique and memorable experience was my due, and I got it, by the common voice of this community, by acclamation of the people, that mighty utterance which brushes aside laws and legislation, and from whose decree there is no appeal. I was named perpetual member of the diplomatic body representing the multifarious sovereignties and civilizations of the globe near the Republican Court of the United States of America, and they brought me home with a torchlight procession. It's wonderful, Colonel, simply wonderful. It is the loftiest official position in the whole earth. I should think so, and the most commanding. You have named the word. Think of it. I frown, and there is a war. I smile, and contending nations lay down their arms. It is awful, the responsibility, I mean. It is nothing. Responsibility is no burden to me. I am used to it, have always been used to it.
And the work. The work. Do you have to attend all the sittings?
Who, I? Does the Emperor of Russia attend the conclaves of the governors of the provinces? He sits at home and indicates his pleasure.
Washington was silent a moment, then a deep sigh escaped him. Oh, how proud I was an hour ago. How paltry seems my little promotion now. Colonel, the reason I came to Washington is I am congressional delegate from Cherokee Strip. The colonel sprang to his feet and broke out with prodigious enthusiasm.
Give me your hand, my boy. This is immense news. I congratulate you with all my heart. My prophecies stand firm. I always said it was in you. I always said you were born for high distinction and would achieve it. You ask Polly if I didn't.
Washington was dazed by this most unexpected demonstration. Why, Colonel, there's nothing to it. That little, narrow, desolate, unpeopled, oblong streak of grass and gravel, lost in the remote wastes of the vast continent, why, it's like representing a billiard table, a discarded one.
Tut, tut, it's a staving preferment, and just opulent with influence here.
Shucks, Colonel, I haven't even a vote.
That's nothing. You can make speeches.
No, I can't. The population's only 200.
That's all right. That's all right.
And they hadn't any right to elect me. We're not even a territory. There's no organic act. The government hasn't any official knowledge of us whatever.
Never mind about that. I'll fix that. I'll rush the thing through. I'll get you organized in no time.
Will you, Colonel? It's too good of you. But it's just your old sterling self, the same old ever-faithful friend. And the grateful tears welled up in Washington's eyes.
It's just as good as done, my boy, just as good as done. Shake hands. We'll hitch teams together, you and I, and we'll make things hum.
End of section 10.
Section 11 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Mason. Section 11, Incidents in a Retired Life, by Frederick William Shelton. Last year I had a solitary peach upon a solitary tree, for the early frost frustrated the delicious crop. This only one, which from its golden color might be entitled El Dorado, I watched with fear and trembling from day to day, patiently waiting for the identical time when I should buoy it up carefully in my hand, that its pulp should not be bruised, tear off its thin peel, admonished that the time had come by a gradual releasing of the fruit from its adhesion to the stem, and I appointed the next day for the ceremonial of plucking. The morrow dawned, as bright a day as ever dawned upon the earth, and on a near approach I found it still there, and said, with chuckling gratification, "There is some delicacy in thieves." Alas, on reaching it, somebody had taken a large bite out of the ripest cheek, but with a sacrilegious witticism had left it sticking to the stem. The detestable prints of the teeth which bit it were still in it, and a wasp was gloating at its core. Had he taken the whole peach, I should have vented my feelings in a violence of indignation unsuited to a balmy garden. But as he was joker enough to bite only its sunny side, I must forgive him, as one who has some element of salvation in his character, because he is disposed to look at the bright side of things. What is a peach? A mere globe of succulent and delicious pulp, which I would rather be deprived of than cultivate bad feelings, even toward thieves. Wherever you find rogues whose deeds involve a saline element of wit, make up your mind that they are no rogues. Up the river. This morning the Shanghai hen laid another egg of a rich brunette complexion, which we took away and replaced by a common vulgar egg, intending to reserve the Shanghais in a cool place until the time of incubation. Very much amused was I with the sequel. The proud and haughty superiority of the breed manifested itself by detecting the cheat and resenting the insult. Shang and Ing flew at the supposititious egg with the utmost indignation and picked it to pieces, scratching the remnants of the shell from the nest. There is one peculiarity of these fowls which deserves to be mentioned. When I removed mine from the basket, I thought that the worthy donor had clipped their wings to prevent them from flying away or scaling the hennery. On further knowledge, I have learned that their style and fashion is that of the jacket sleeve and bobtail coat. Their eminent domesticity is clearly signified by this, because they cannot get over an ordinary fence, and would not if they could. It is because they have no disposition to do this that nature has cropped them of their superfluous wings and given them a plumage suitable to their desires. Their sober wishes never learn to stray. They often come into the kitchen, but never go abroad to associate with common fowls, but remain at home in dignified retirement. Another thing remarkable and quite renowned about this is the oriental courtesy and politeness of the cock. If you throw a piece of bread, he waits till the hen helps herself first, and often carries it to her in his own beak. The feathered people in the East, and those not feathered, are far superior to ours in those elaborate and delightful forms of manner which add a charm and zest to life. This has been from the days of Abraham until now. There are no common people in these realms. All are polite, and the very roosters illustrate the best principles laid down in any book of etiquette. Book of etiquette? What is conventionalism without the inborn sense? Can any man or beast be taught to be mechanically polite? Not at all. Not at all. I have received a present of a pair of Cochin chinas, a superb cock and a dun-colored hen. I put them with my other fowls in the cellar to protect them for a short time from the severity of the weather. My Shanghai rooster had for several nights been housed up, for on one occasion, when the cold was snapping, he was discovered under the lee of a stone wall, standing on one leg, taking no notice of the approach of anyone, and nearly gone. When brought in, he backed up against the red-hot kitchen stove and burned his tail off. Before this he had no feathers in the rear to speak of, and now he is bobtailed indeed. Anne sewed upon him a jacket of carpet, and put him in a tea-box for the night, and it was ludicrous on the next morning to see him lifting up his head above the square prison box and crowing lustily to greet the day. But before breakfast time he had a dreadful fit. He retreated against the wall, he fell upon his side, he kicked and he carried on, but when the carpet was taken off, he came to himself and ate corn with a voracious appetite. His indisposition was, no doubt, occasioned by a rush of blood to the head from the tightness of the bandages. When Shanghai and Cochin met together in the cellar, they enacted in that dusky hole all the barbarities of a profane cockpit. I heard a sound as if from the tumbling of barrels, followed by a dull thumping noise like spirit rappings, and went below, where the first object which met my eye was a mouse creeping along the beam out of an excavation in my pineapple cheese. As for the fowls, instead of salutation after the respectful manner of their country, which is expressed thus, Shang knocks knees to Cochin, bows 3 times, touches the ground, and makes obeisance. They were engaged in a bloody fight unworthy of celestial poultry. With their heads down, eyes flashing and red as vipers, and with a feathery frill or ruffle about their necks, they were leaping at each other to see who should hold dominion over the ash heap. It put me exactly in mind of 2 Scythians or 2 Greeks in America, where each wished to be considered the only Scythian or only Greek in the country. A contest or emulation is at all times highly animating and full of zest, whether 2 scholars write, 2 athletes strive, 2 boilers strain, or 2 cocks fight. Every lazy dog in the vicinity is immediately at hand. I looked on until I saw the Shanghai's peepers darkened and his comb streaming with blood. These birds contended for some days after for preeminence on the lawn, and no flinching could be observed on either part, although the Shanghai was by 1/3 the smaller of the 2. At last the latter was thoroughly mortified. His eyes wavered and wandered vaguely as he stood opposite the foe. He turned tail and ran. From that moment he became the veriest coward, and submitted to every indignity without attempting to resist. He suffered himself to be chased about the lawn, fled from the Indian meal, and was almost starved. Such submission on his part at last resulted in peace, and the 2 rivals walked side by side without fighting, and ate together with a mutual concession of the corn. This, in turn, engendered a degree of presumption on the part of the Shanghai cock, and one day, when the dew sparkled and the sun shone peculiarly bright, he so far forgot himself as to ascend a hillock and venture on a tolerably triumphant crow. It showed a lack of judgment. His cock-a-doodle-doo proved fatal. Scarcely had he done so when Cochin China rushed upon him, tore out his feathers, and flogged him so severely that it was doubtful whether he would remain with us. Now, alas, he presents a sad spectacle. His comb frozen off, his tail burned off, and his head knocked to a jelly. While the corn jingles in the throats of his compeers when they eagerly snap it, as if they were eating from a pile of shilling pieces or 5-penny bits, he stands aloof and grubs in the ground. How changed! Up the river. A clergyman was very anxious to introduce some hymn books into the church, and arranged with his clerk that the latter was to give out the notice immediately after the sermon. The clerk, however, had a notice of his own to give out, with reference to the baptism of infants. Accordingly, at the close of the sermon, he arose and announced that all those who have children whom they wish to have baptized, please send in their names at once to the clerk. The clergyman, who was stone deaf, assumed that the clerk was giving out the hymn book notice, and immediately rose and said, "And I should say, for the benefit of those who haven't any, that they may be obtained at the vestry any day from 3 to 4 o'clock. The ordinary little ones at 1 shilling each, and special ones with red backs at 1 shilling and 4 pence." End of section 11. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.
Section 12 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Pyle. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2, edited by Thomas Lansing Mason. Section 12. Melons, by Bret Harte. As I do not suppose the most gentle of readers will believe that anybody's sponsors in baptism ever willfully assume the responsibility of such a name, I may as well state that I have reason to infer that Melons was simply the nickname of a small boy I once knew. If he had any other, I never knew it. Various theories were often projected by me to account for this strange cognomen. His head, which was covered with a transparent down, like that which clothes very small chickens, plainly permitting the scalp to show through, to an imaginative mind might have suggested that succulent vegetable. That his parents, recognizing some poetical significance in the fruits of the season, might have given this name to an August child was an Oriental explanation. That from his infancy he was fond of indulging in melons seemed on the whole the most likely, particularly as fancy was not bred in McGinnis's court. He dawned upon me as Melons. His proximity was indicated by shrill youthful voices as "Ah, Melons," or playfully "Hi, Melons," or authoritatively "You, Melons." McGinnis's court was a democratic expression of some obstinate and radical property holder. Occupying a limited space between two fashionable thoroughfares, it refused to conform to circumstances, but sturdily paraded its unkempt glories, and frequently asserted itself in ungrammatical language. My window, a rear room on the ground floor, in this way derived blended light and shadow from the court. So low was the window sill that, had I been the least disposed to somnambulism, it would have broken out under such favorable auspices, and I should have haunted McGinnis's court. My speculations as to the origin of the court were not altogether gratuitous. For by means of this window I once saw the past as through a glass darkly. It was a Celtic shadow that early one morning obstructed my ancient lights. It seemed to belong to an individual with a pea coat, a stubby pipe, and bristling beard. He was gazing intently at the court, resting on a heavy cane, somewhat in the way that heroes dramatically visit the scenes of their boyhood. As there was little of architectural beauty in the court, I came to the conclusion that it was McGinnis looking after his property. The fact that he carefully kicked a broken bottle out of the road somewhat strengthened me in the opinion. But he presently walked away, and the court knew him no more. He probably collected his rents by proxy, if he collected them at all. Beyond Melons, of whom all this is purely introductory, there was little to interest the most sanguine and hopeful nature. In common with all such localities, a great deal of washing was done, in comparison with the visible results. There was always something whisking on the line, and always something whisking through the court that looked as if it ought to be there. A fish geranium, of all plants kept for the recreation of mankind certainly the greatest illusion, straggled under the window. Through its dusty leaves I caught the first glance of Melons. His age was about 7. He looked older from the venerable whiteness of his head, and it was impossible to conjecture his size, as he always wore clothes apparently belonging to some shapely youth of 19. A pair of pantaloons that, when sustained by a single suspender, completely equipped him, formed his everyday suit. How, with this lavish superfluity of clothing, he managed to perform the surprising gymnastic feats it had been my privilege to witness, I have never been able to tell. His turning the crab and other minor dislocations were always attended with success. It was not an unusual sight at any hour of the day to find Melons suspended on a line, or to see his venerable head appearing above the roofs of the outhouses. Melons knew the exact height of every fence in the vicinity, its facilities for scaling, and the possibility of seizure on the other side. His more peaceful and quieter amusements consisted in dragging a disused boiler by a large string, with hideous outcries, to imaginary fires. Melons was not gregarious in his habits. A few youth of his own age sometimes called upon him, but they eventually became abusive, and their visits were more strictly predatory incursions for old bottles and junk, which formed the staple of McGinnis's court. Overcome by loneliness one day, Melons inveigled a blind harper into the court. For 2 hours did that wretched man prosecute his unhallowed calling, unrecompensed, and going round and round the court, apparently under the impression that it was some other place, while Melons surveyed him from an adjoining fence with calm satisfaction. It was this absence of conscientious motive that brought Melons into disrepute with his aristocratic neighbors. Orders were issued that no child of wealthy and pious parentage should play with him. This mandate, as a matter of course, invested Melons with a fascinating interest to them. Admiring glances were cast at Melons from nursery windows. Baby fingers beckoned to him. Invitations to tea, on wood and pewter, were lisped to him from aristocratic backyards. It was evident he was looked upon as a pure and noble being, untrammeled by the conventionalities of parentage, and physically as well as mentally exalted above them. One afternoon an unusual commotion prevailed in the vicinity of McGinnis's Court. Looking from my window, I saw Melons perched on the roof of a stable, pulling up a rope by which one Tommy, an infant scion of an adjacent and wealthy house, was suspended in midair. In vain the female relatives of Tommy congregated in the backyard, expostulated with Melons. In vain the unhappy father shook his fist at him. Secure in his position, Melons redoubled his exertions, and at last landed Tommy on the roof. Then it was that the humiliating fact was disclosed that Tommy had been acting in collusion with Melons. He grinned delightfully back at his parents, as if by merit raised to that bad eminence. Long before the latter arrived that was to succor him, he became the sworn ally of Melons, and I regret to say, incited by the same audacious boy, chafed his own flesh and blood below him. He was eventually taken, though, of course, Melons escaped. But Tommy was restricted to the window after that, and the companionship was limited to, "Hi, Melons," and "You, Tommy." And Melons, to all practical purposes, lost him forever. I looked afterward to see some signs of sorrow on Melons' part, but in vain. He buried his grief, if he had any, somewhere in his one voluminous garment. At about this time my opportunities of knowing Melons became more extended. I was engaged in filling a void in the literature of the Pacific Coast. As this void was a pretty large one, and as I was informed that the Pacific Coast languished under it, I set apart 2 hours each day to this work of filling in. It was necessary that I should adopt a methodical system. So I retired from the world and locked myself in my room at a certain hour each day after coming from my office. I then carefully drew out my portfolio and read what I had written the day before. This would suggest some alterations, and I would carefully rewrite it. During this operation I would turn to consult a book of reference, which invariably proved extremely interesting and attractive. It would generally suggest another and better method of filling in. Turning this method over reflectively in my mind, I would finally commence the new method, which I eventually abandoned for the original plan. At this time I would become convinced that my exhausted faculties demanded a cigar. The operation of lighting a cigar usually suggested that a little quiet reflection and meditation would be of service to me, and I always allowed myself to be guided by prudential instincts. Eventually, seated by my window, as before stated, Melons asserted himself. Though our conversation rarely went further than "Hello, mister," and "Ah, Melons," a vagabond instinct we felt in common implied a communion deeper than words. Thus time passed, often beguiled by gymnastics on the fence or line, always with an eye to my window, until dinner was announced and I found a more practical void required my attention. An unlooked-for incident drew us in closer relation. A seafaring friend, just from a tropical voyage, had presented me with a bunch of bananas. They were not quite ripe, and I hung them before my window to mature in the sun of McGinnis's Court, whose forcing qualities were remarkable. In the mysteriously mingled odors of ship and shore which they diffused throughout my room, there was lingering reminiscence of low latitudes. But even that joy was fleeting and evanescent. They never reached maturity. Coming home one day, as I turned the corner of that fashionable thoroughfare before alluded to, I met a small boy eating a banana. There was nothing remarkable in that, but as I neared McGinnis's Court I presently met another small boy also eating a banana. A third small boy engaged in a like occupation obtruded a painful coincidence upon my mind. I leave the psychological reader to determine the exact correlation between the circumstance and the sickening sense of loss that overcame me on witnessing it. I reached my room and found the bunch of bananas was gone. There was but one that knew of their existence, but one who frequented my window, but one capable of gymnastic effort to procure them, and that was, I blush to say it, Melons. Melons, the depredator. Melons, despoiled by larger boys of his ill-gotten booty, or reckless and indiscreetly liberal. Melons, now a fugitive on some neighborhood housetop. I lit a cigar, and drawing my chair to the window, sought surcease of sorrow in the contemplation of the fish geranium. In a few moments something white passed my window at about the level of the edge. There was no mistaking that hoary head, which now represented to me only aged iniquity. It was Melons, that venerable juvenile hypocrite. He affected not to observe me, and would have withdrawn quietly, but that horrible fascination which causes the murderer to revisit the scene of his crime impelled him toward my window. I smoked calmly and gazed at him without speaking. He walked several times up and down the court with a half-rigid, half-belligerent expression of eye and shoulder, intended to represent the carelessness of innocence. Once or twice he stopped, and putting his arms their whole length into his capacious trousers, gazed with some interest at the additional width they thus acquired. Then he whistled. The singular conflicting contradictions of John Brown's body and soul were at that time beginning to attract the attention of youth, and Mellon's performance of that melody was always remarkable. But today he whistled falsely and shrilly between his teeth. At last he met my eye. He winced slightly, but recovered himself, and going to the fence, stood for a few moments on his hands with his bare feet quivering in the air. Then he turned toward me and threw out a conversational preliminary. "They is a circus," said Mellons gravely, hanging with his back to the fence and his arms twisted around the palings. "A circus over yonder," indicating the locality with his foot, "with hosses and hossback riders. They is a man what rides 6 hosses to onct, and nary saddle," and he paused in expectation. Even this equestrian novelty did not affect me. I still kept a fixed gaze on Mellon's eye, and he began to tremble and visibly shrink in his capacious garment. Some other desperate means — conversation with Mellons was always a desperate means — must be resorted to. He recommenced more artfully. "Do you know Carrots?" I had a faint remembrance of a boy with that euphonious name, with scarlet hair, who was a playmate and persecutor of Mellons, but I said nothing. "Carrots is a bad boy. Kilt a policeman onct. Wears a dirk knife in his boots. Saw him today looking in your windy." I felt this must end here. I rose sternly and addressed Mellons. "Mellons, this is all irrelevant and impertinent to the case. You took those bananas. Your proposition regarding Carrots, even if I were inclined to accept it as credible information, does not alter the material issue. You took those bananas. The offense under the statutes of California is felony. How far Carrots may have been accessory to the fact, either before or after, it is not my intention at present to discuss. The act is complete. Your present conduct shows the animo furandi to have been equally clear." By the time I had finished this exordium, Mellons had disappeared, as I fully expected. He never reappeared. The remorse that I have experienced for the part I had taken in what I fear may have resulted in his utter and complete extermination, alas, he may not know, except through these pages. For I have never seen him since. Whether he ran away and went to sea to reappear at some future day as the most ancient of mariners, or whether he buried himself completely in his trousers, I shall never know. I have read the papers anxiously for accounts of him. I have gone to the police office in the vain attempt of identifying him as a lost child. But I never saw him or heard of him since. Strange fears have sometimes crossed my mind that his venerable appearance may have been actually the result of senility, and that he may have been gathered peacefully to his fathers in a green old age. I have even had doubts of his existence, and have sometimes thought that he was providentially and mysteriously offered to fill the void I have before alluded to. In that hope I have written these pages. From Mrs. Skaggs's Husbands and Other Sketches. End of section 12. Recording by Chris Pyle.